Swallowed by a whale, falling 33,000 feet from the sky. Trapped at sea for over a year. Sounds like something out of a movie, right? But these are real survival stories. Stories that prove the human will to live is stronger than anything. Some of them defy logic, others rewrite the rules of nature, but one thing's for sure. You won't believe what these people went through and actually survived. Let's dive in. 1. Lost at sea for over a year. Sounds like a death sentence, right? Not for Jose Salvador Alvarenga. In 2012, a violent storm sent his fishing boat drifting into the Pacific, where he spent 438 days surviving on raw fish, rainwater, and sheer determination. By the time he washed up on a remote island, locals thought he was a ghost. Honestly, after over a year alone at sea, I'd probably start questioning if I was real too. 2. One moment, you're serving coffee on a flight. The next, you're plummeting 33,000 feet toward the ground. That was the horrifying reality for Vesna Vulovic, a flight attendant who miraculously survived a mid-air explosion in 1972. She landed on snow-covered ground, breaking almost every bone in her body, but she lived. And to top it all off, she later said she had no fear of flying. That's some next-level resilience. 3. Trapped beneath a half-ton boulder in a remote Utah canyon, Aaron Ralston had to make an unthinkable choice: cut off his own arm or die. After 5 excruciating days, he grabbed a dull pocket knife and did what had to be done. If you've seen 127 Hours, you know how brutal this was. But what's even crazier? After escaping, he hiked 7 miles to find help, while still bleeding out. 4. Ever wonder what it's like inside a whale's mouth? Michael Packard doesn't have to imagine. He knows. In 2021, this lobster diver was scooped up by a humpback whale and held in its mouth for 30 seconds before being spat back into the ocean. Think about that. He was literally swallowed whole and lived to tell the story. That's one way to make a splash. 5. A plane breaks apart in midair. Everyone perishes, except for one person. That's what happened to 17-year-old Julianne Cupsey in 1971. Strapped to her seat, she fell 10,000 feet into the Amazon rainforest and somehow survived. But her nightmare was far from over. She spent 11 days alone, trekking through the jungle with maggot-infested wounds before finally finding rescue. Survival instincts on another level. 6. Mauled by a grizzly bear, left for dead, and miles away from any civilization, most people wouldn't stand a chance. But Hugh Glass wasn't most people. In 1823, after being abandoned by his own men, he dragged himself 200 miles through the wilderness, using maggots to clean his wounds and eating whatever he could find. The Revenant made it famous, but real life? Even more insane. 7. A crash. A remote mountain range. No food. For the 16 survivors of the 1972 Andes plane disaster, the situation was beyond hopeless. They spent 72 days in freezing temperatures, forced to do the unthinkable, eat the bodies of their dead friends, to stay alive. Their harrowing story became the book and film alive, proving that when it comes to survival, desperation knows no limits. 8. 2 atomic bombs, 2 cities, 1 survivor. Tsutomu Yamaguchi holds a tragic world record. He survived both the Hiroshima and Nagasaki bombings in 1945. After witnessing the first explosion, he fled to the second city, only to experience another nuclear blast 3 days later. The fact that he lived to tell his story and continued working for nuclear disarmament is nothing short of astonishing. 9. Imagine being trapped 100 feet underwater in total darkness with no way out. That was the reality for Harrison Okene, a Nigerian cook whose ship capsized in 2013. As the crew perished, he found an air pocket and survived for 60 hours, waiting for rescue while sharks circled outside. When divers finally found him, they assumed he was dead, until he reached out and grabbed one of them. Talk about a horror movie moment. 10. The Atlantic Ocean is not a place you want to be stranded, but for Stephen Callahan, there was no choice. When his sailboat sank in 1981, he was left drifting alone in a tiny life raft for 76 days. Dehydration, shark attacks, and starvation became his daily reality, but somehow he made it, proving that sometimes survival is just as much about mental strength as physical endurance. 11. A simple hike in the Australian outback turned into a 43-day nightmare for Ricky Meiji. After his car was stolen and he was left to die in the middle of nowhere, he survived on frogs, insects, and rainwater collected in leaves. By the time rescuers found him, he was a walking skeleton, having lost over 120 pounds. Australia's already dangerous enough without adding starvation to the mix. 12. Being stranded in the Arctic is bad enough. Being stranded there with no food or weapons? That's a death sentence, unless you're Ada Blackjack. In 1921, she was part of an expedition to a remote Arctic island. But when everything went wrong, she became the sole survivor. She fended off polar bears, trapped foxes for food, and braved freezing temperatures for 2 years until help finally arrived. They called her the female Robinson Crusoe. And honestly, that's an understatement. 13. A German soldier, Clemens Forel, was sentenced to 25 years in a Soviet labor camp in Siberia after World War II. His response? Escape. Over 3 years, he traveled 8,000 miles across some of the harshest landscapes on Earth, on foot, until he finally reached freedom. His journey was so incredible, people didn't believe it was real. But after all he went through, what's more unbelievable? His escape or the fact that he survived it all? 14. When Beck Weathers set out to climb Everest in 1996, he never expected to be left for dead twice. After being caught in a brutal storm, he slipped into unconsciousness and was declared dead, twice, by different rescue teams. But hours later, he somehow woke up, frostbitten and blind, and walked himself back to camp. He lost his nose, hands, and feet to frostbite, but let's be real, he was never supposed to make it back at all. 15. In 1982, pilot Jim Black was flying a single-engine plane over the Pacific when it suddenly ran out of fuel. With no land in sight, he and his 2 passengers ditched the plane into the ocean. For 24 hours, they clung to the wreckage, battling exhaustion, dehydration, and circling tiger sharks before finally being rescued by a passing cargo ship. Fun fact: the ship's crew spotted them only because someone happened to be using binoculars at that exact moment. Talk about lucky. 16. A kidnapping, a 9-year captivity, a daring escape. That's the story of Natascha Kampusch, an Austrian girl who was abducted in 1998 at the age of 10. She spent nearly a decade locked in a tiny underground cell before finally breaking free in 2006. Despite the unimaginable trauma, she went on to write a book about her survival. Resilience doesn't even begin to describe it. 17. It's 1971. A British man named Douglas Robertson is sailing across the Pacific with his family when a pod of killer whales sinks their boat. With nothing but a tiny inflatable raft and limited supplies, they drifted for 38 days, drinking rainwater and surviving on raw fish before being rescued. His survival tip? Always pack emergency supplies and maybe avoid killer whale territory. 18. The year is 1820. A whaling ship named Essex is attacked by a massive sperm whale, yes, like Moby Dick. The ship sinks, and the crew is left stranded in small boats for over 90 days. Starvation forces them into cannibalism, and only 8 men make it out alive. The real kicker? This story inspired Moby Dick, but the truth was far worse than fiction. 19. When 2 Alaskan hunters got stranded on a remote ice floe in the Bering Sea, they had no way to call for help. For 5 days, they drifted 50 miles on a chunk of ice, battling freezing temperatures and near starvation before finally being spotted by a search plane. Imagine being lost at sea, but instead of water, you're surrounded by miles of nothing but ice. 20. In 1942, an American pilot named Eddie Rickenbacker crash-landed in the Pacific during World War II. With no food or water, he and his crew spent 24 days adrift, surviving on rainwater and fish they caught with their bare hands. At one point, a seagull landed on his head, so he grabbed it, killed it, and ate it raw. That bird saved their lives. So next time a seagull steals your fries, maybe cut it some slack. 21. It's one thing to be stranded on an island, it's another to be stranded there for 41 years. Alexander Selkirk, a Scottish sailor, was left on an uninhabited island in the Pacific in 1704 after a dispute with his captain. Armed with nothing but a musket, a knife, and a Bible, he survived by hunting goats, building shelters, and even taming wild cats to keep the rats away. His story inspired Robinson Crusoe, but real life was even wilder. 22. In 2003, mountaineer Lincoln Hall reached the summit of Everest, but on the way down, altitude sickness shut down his body and mind. His team left him for dead at 28,000 feet. But the next morning, another group found him, barely alive and hallucinating, sitting on the mountain with no gloves, no oxygen, and no memory of how he survived the night. If Everest had a ghost, it would have been him. 23. The Amazon rainforest is the last place you want to be lost. But in 1981, Yossi Ginsberg ended up alone in the jungle for 19 days after being separated from his expedition. With no food, he survived by eating raw eggs, fruits, and even a snake he killed with a rock. He later wrote a book about his ordeal, which became the movie Jungle. Let's just say it's not the kind of vacation anyone dreams of. 24. In 2014, a 7-year-old girl survived a plane crash in Kentucky that killed everyone else on board. With broken bones and no shoes, she walked nearly a mile through the freezing woods to find help. When she knocked on a stranger's door, the homeowner almost didn't believe his eyes. A 7-year-old girl walking away from a plane crash? That's not something you see every day. 25. It's 1960. A young girl named Tsering Lamo is caught in an avalanche in Tibet and buried under the snow for 2 hours. Everyone assumes she's gone. But when rescuers finally dig her out, she's still alive, having survived in a tiny air pocket. Scientists still don't know how she avoided suffocation or hypothermia, but sometimes nature lets you bend the rules. 26. Stranded in the Alaskan wilderness with only a can of beans and a rifle, Timothy de Herrera survived 11 days by building snow shelters and hunting rabbits. The kicker? His rescue was delayed because of a moose. Yep, the rescue team couldn't land their helicopter because a stubborn moose refused to leave the clearing. Imagine making it through blizzards and starvation just to be blocked by a moose. 27. In 1956, a commercial airliner crashed into the Grand Canyon, killing everyone, except for one person. A stewardess named Barbara Rowe survived the fall, clinging to the wreckage until rescuers found her. With broken bones and serious burns, she somehow managed to stay alive in the desert heat for 2 days. Some people defy the odds. Barbara rewrote them. 28. It's 2004. An earthquake off the coast of Indonesia triggers a massive tsunami, wiping out entire cities. Somehow, a 7-year-old girl named Martina survives by clinging to a floating mattress for over 2 days before being rescued. Her story is just one of many from that disaster, proving that sometimes the will to live is stronger than the forces of nature. 29. Imagine being hunted for 9 months. That's exactly what happened to Nadia Murad, who was captured by ISIS in 2014 and held as a slave. She escaped, disguised herself, and fled across enemy lines, eventually reaching safety. Years later, she won the Nobel Peace Prize for her bravery and activism. Some survival stories don't just end in rescue, they end in changing the world. 30. A snowboarder got buried alive in an avalanche in the Swiss Alps. With only one hand free, he managed to carve out a small air pocket in the snow. For 50 minutes, he lay there, slowly running out of oxygen, until rescuers finally found him. Seconds before, he would have suffocated. Talk about cutting it close. 31. In 2019, 2 sisters, aged 5 and 8, got lost in the Northern California wilderness. With no supplies and freezing temperatures, they survived for 2 days by huddling together under a bush. When rescuers finally found them, they said they survived because their dad taught them to never panic and always stay together. Parenting win. 32. The Sahara Desert is not the place to be stranded. But in 1994, Mauro Prosperi, an Italian marathon runner, got caught in a sandstorm during a 155-mile race. He wandered the desert for 9 days, drinking his own urine and eating bats to stay alive. By the time he was found, he had lost over 35 pounds, but he still finished another ultramarathon years later. Some people never learn. 33. In 1932, a man named Joe Simpson fell into a deep crevasse while descending a mountain in Peru. His partner, thinking he was dead, left him behind. But Joe crawled out with a shattered leg and dragged himself 6 miles to safety over the next 3 days. His book, Touching the Void, became a legendary survival story, but honestly, it's more of a horror story. 34. If you thought getting lost at sea was bad, imagine being trapped in an iceberg for 6 months. In 1916, Ernest Shackleton and his crew got stuck when their ship was crushed by ice in Antarctica. With no way out, they camped on the ice for half a year before finally making a daring escape on lifeboats. Survival mode, expert level. 35. In 2007, a teenager named Brittany Diggs was kidnapped and stuffed into the trunk of a car by an armed robber. As the car sped down the highway, she managed to unlock the trunk from the inside and jump out onto the road. She hit the pavement at full speed but survived. If there's one thing we learned here, it's that knowing how to escape a car trunk might just save your life one day. 36. Trapped inside a sunken submarine for 72 hours. In 1939, a U.S. Navy submarine sank off the coast of New Hampshire. One crew member survived by sealing himself in a watertight compartment, rationing oxygen until a rescue team finally drilled a hole and pulled him out. 37. A lightning strike stopped his heart, but somehow he lived. In 2015, a man in Colorado was hit by a direct lightning strike while hiking. His heart stopped for over 2 minutes, but his friends performed CPR, and miraculously, he came back to life. 38. Antarctica is the last place you want to be left behind, but in 1913, Douglas Mawson faced exactly that. His sled dogs died, his supplies ran out, and his skin literally started falling off due to vitamin deficiency. Somehow, he crawled 100 miles back to base camp in one of the most extreme survival feats ever recorded. 39. Tornadoes are terrifying, but getting sucked into one? That's exactly what happened to a 9-year-old girl in 2011 when an EF4 tornado lifted her house off the ground. She was thrown over 100 yards, landing in a field completely unharmed. Rescuers couldn't believe she survived. 40. A routine hot air balloon ride over the Nevada desert turned into a fight for survival when strong winds sent it crashing into the mountains. One survivor, despite suffering multiple broken ribs, hiked for 14 hours to find help while battling dehydration and extreme heat. 41. No supplies. No hope of rescue. A raft drifting aimlessly in the open ocean. For 133 days, Poon Lim survived alone in the Atlantic after his ship was sunk during World War II. He caught fish with his bare hands, drank rainwater, and even fought off a shark using a wooden plank. 42. A mother, a snowstorm, and an impossible choice. Jean Hilliard was walking home in Minnesota when she collapsed from the cold and was frozen solid overnight. When she was found the next morning, her skin was rock hard, her pulse barely detectable, and doctors believed there was no chance of survival. Then, somehow, she woke up and fully recovered. 43. A group of prisoners escaped from a Soviet gulag in Siberia, only to face a much bigger challenge, walking 4,000 miles to freedom. Through endless forests, frozen mountains, and scorching deserts, only 3 survived. Their journey was so incredible that people doubted it ever happened, but records prove it did. 44. 23,000 feet up on K2, the second highest mountain on Earth, Marco Confortola was trapped in one of the deadliest storms in climbing history. With frostbite setting in and no way down, he cut off his own dying toes with a pocket knife to avoid infection. Somehow, he managed to descend alone, becoming one of the only survivors of that disaster. 45. A leopard attack should be a death sentence, not for 12-year-old Kamala Devi. When a wild leopard attacked her in India, she fought back using only a sickle and her bare hands, wrestling the animal for 30 minutes before finally killing it. By the time she reached a hospital, she had over 100 stitches, and a survival story like no other. 46. An avalanche buried Anna Bogenholm under 3 feet of ice for 80 minutes. Her body temperature dropped to 56 degrees Fahrenheit, 13 degrees Celsius, far below what should be survivable. And yet, after being pulled out and slowly rewarmed, she came back to life. Scientists still don't fully understand how she survived without brain damage. 47. Imagine being lost in the Amazon for 38 days, battling piranhas, jaguars, and infection. That's what happened to Antonio Senna, a pilot who crashed deep in the rainforest in 2021. His only guide? A river he followed for over a month until he finally stumbled upon help. 48. Shot in the head, thrown into a grave, and still alive. In 2012, a South African woman was attacked, shot, and left for dead in a shallow grave. Somehow, she clawed her way out and walked barefoot for miles to find help. 49. A crocodile-infested swamp, a plane crash, and a lone survivor. That's what 17-year-old Annette Herfkens faced when her plane crashed in the Vietnamese jungle. Surrounded by bodies and deadly predators, she survived for 8 days on rainwater and sheer willpower before being found. 50. The largest tsunami ever recorded struck Lituya Bay, Alaska, in 1958, sending 700-foot waves crashing into the shore. One family on a fishing boat was lifted up by the tsunami, carried over a forest, and somehow landed safely in open water. Their boat should have been crushed instantly. Instead, they rode a tsunami like a roller coaster and lived to tell the tale. 51. A family camping trip turned into a battle against a mountain lion when 13-year-old Nathan Gorley was attacked in California. With nothing but his fists and a rock, he fought back long enough for his father to intervene. Despite severe injuries, he survived, while the mountain lion didn't. 52. A freak accident, a severed arm, and one goal: stay alive. In 2018, factory worker Jonathan Metz got his arm stuck in an industrial furnace. With no food, no phone, and infection setting in, Jonathan Metz knew his time was running out. So he grabbed a hacksaw and started cutting through his own flesh. 3 days later, rescuers found him still alive. His survival instinct was stronger than the pain. 53. Being stranded at sea is bad enough. Being stranded in a raft with hungry saltwater crocodiles nearby? That's what happened to a group of WO2 airmen when their plane crashed in the Pacific. For weeks, they battled starvation, dehydration, and crocodiles that tried to climb into the raft. Only 2 men survived to tell the tale. 54. A baby survived a fall from a crashing airplane. In 2012, a small plane exploded mid-air, and among the wreckage, rescuers found a 14-month-old baby alive in a tree, cushioned by branches. No one could explain how the infant escaped the impact unscathed. 55. 4 days buried alive in a collapsed mine. In 2010, a Chilean miner named Edison Peña was trapped nearly half a mile underground after a tunnel collapse. Instead of giving up, he ran miles each day in the dark tunnels to keep himself sane. When rescuers finally pulled him out, he was in better shape than most people on the surface. 56. The Amazon is unforgiving, especially when you crash into it. In 1966, pilot Robert Wilson's plane went down in the jungle. He had no supplies, no way to call for help, just his survival skills. He built a raft from tree branches and floated down the river for 13 days before finally reaching civilization. 57. A 60-foot fall from a bridge should have been the end. But in 2004, Angela Hernandez survived just that after her car plunged off a cliff in Big Sur, California. With broken ribs and no way to call for help, she lay on the shore, listening to the waves crash. Trapped on the rocky shore for 7 days, she drank water dripping from moss-covered rocks until she was rescued. 58. Lost in the Grand Canyon for over a month. In 1986, a hiker went missing and was given up for dead, until another group stumbled upon him 35 days later, surviving on rainwater and cactus pulp. He had lost over 50 pounds but refused to give up. 59. A wrong turn into a snowstorm nearly became fatal for 2 Canadian men in 2012. Their truck got stuck in deep snow, leaving them trapped for 3 days in sub-zero temperatures. Their lifesaver? A pack of frozen beer. They melted the ice-cold liquid and drank it for hydration, proving that beer can save lives. 60. Hurricane Katrina forced thousands into desperate situations, but one woman's survival story stood out. Trapped in her attic as floodwaters rose, she used a chainsaw to cut through her roof, escaping just before the house was submerged. When rescuers found her, she was perched on the rooftop waving for help. 61. A bear attack is terrifying, but being attacked twice? In 2015, Todd Orr was mauled by a grizzly in Montana. After the first attack, he stumbled back toward his car, only for the bear to come back and maul him again. Despite deep wounds and blood loss, he still managed to walk 3 miles to safety. 62. In the middle of the ocean, floating alone for nearly 2 days? That was Brett Archibald's nightmare in 2013. He fell overboard during a cruise and spent 29 hours treading water, battling dehydration, jellyfish stings, and even a seagull that tried to peck his eyes. When a passing ship finally spotted him, he was barely conscious, but alive. 63. A 600-pound tiger shark attacked a diver off the coast of Hawaii, dragging him 40 feet underwater. With no time to panic, he jammed his hand into the shark's gills and punched it until it let go. Bleeding and exhausted, he managed to swim back to his boat. The shark didn't get its meal that day. 64. A 13-story fall onto concrete should have been fatal. But in 2007, Alcides Moreno survived exactly that when a scaffolding platform collapsed in New York. His brother, who fell with him, didn't make it. But Alcides somehow woke up in the hospital weeks later, bruised but alive. 65. No one expects to survive a plane crash in the Himalayas. In 1992, a cargo plane went down in the mountains, and somehow, one crew member made it out alive. Despite freezing temperatures, he trekked through the snow-covered landscape until a group of monks found him and carried him to safety. 66. A plane crash in the middle of the Atlantic should have been the end. But in 2009, 14-year-old Bahia Bakari was the only survivor when her flight plunged into the ocean. With no life vest and surrounded by wreckage, she clung to a piece of debris for 9 hours before rescuers spotted her. When they pulled her out, she was exhausted, injured, but miraculously alive. 67. Forgetting your lunch is one thing. Forgetting to pack oxygen while climbing Everest? That's deadly. In 1984, Australian climber Tim McCartney's Snape reached the summit without bottled oxygen. At 29,000 feet, he started hallucinating and barely made it back down. To this day, his ascent is considered one of the most dangerous Everest climbs ever completed. 68. Stranded at the bottom of a canyon with 2 broken legs. In 2014, a climber in Utah fell 30 feet into a narrow canyon. Unable to walk, he crawled for 4 days through the rocky terrain, using only his elbows until another hiker found him. 69. A python coiling around your body, squeezing the life out of you. That was the nightmare scenario for a Malaysian man in 2018 when a 26-foot python wrapped around him in the jungle. Using only a small knife, he stabbed the snake repeatedly until it finally loosened its grip. Even with broken ribs and deep bite wounds, he somehow managed to stagger to safety. 70. What would you do if a tsunami was coming straight at you? Indonesian teenager Martunis was swept away when the 2004 Indian Ocean tsunami struck. Clinging to a floating mattress, he drifted for 21 days, surviving on rainwater and scavenged food. By the time rescuers found him, he was weak, but somehow still alive. 71. A road trip gone wrong turned into a fight for survival. In 2011, a couple got stranded in the Nevada mountains when their car got stuck in deep snow. With no signal and no help in sight, the husband walked over 20 miles through freezing conditions to find a highway. He made it, but when rescuers arrived, his wife had already rationed their food and melted snow to stay alive for nearly a week alone. 72. A desperate swim to safety through crocodile-infested waters. In 2019, a boat capsized in the Zambezi River, leaving one man stranded. With no other option, he swam for 2 hours, dodging crocodiles and hippos until he reached the shore. The rescue team arrived just in time to see a massive croc lurking where he had just been. 73. A fall from the sky with no parachute should mean instant death. But in 1944, Alan Magee, a Doppler pilot, fell 22,000 feet after his plane was hit over France. His only saving grace? He crashed through the glass roof of a train station, which absorbed some of the impact. He suffered injuries, but he survived, becoming one of the few people to ever live through a fall from that height. 74. A tornado can rip through homes, but can it carry you away and leave you alive? Matt Suter found out in 2006 when a massive twister literally sucked him out of his house and tossed him 1,307 feet away. That's nearly a quarter of a mile. When he landed in a field, he was stunned, bruised, but still breathing. 75. The Alaskan wilderness is merciless, but one man walked out of it after being presumed dead. Carl McCunn, a photographer, arranged for a plane to drop him in a remote area to take wildlife photos. What he forgot? A way back home. He survived for months, eating whatever he could find, before his distress signals were finally seen by rescuers. 76. A deadly snowstorm, no shelter, and temperatures that could kill in minutes. In 2017, 2 skiers got caught in a brutal blizzard in the Alps. With no way out, they dug a snow cave and huddled together for warmth for 24 hours until rescuers reached them. Hypothermia had set in, but their makeshift shelter saved their lives. 77. Imagine waking up and realizing you're buried alive. That was the terrifying reality for a miner in China in 2010, when an underground explosion trapped him in total darkness for 17 days. With no food, he drank dirty water dripping from the walls until rescuers finally reached him. 78. A mountain lion dragged her by the neck, but she fought back. In 2019, a jogger in Colorado was attacked by a mountain lion. With no weapons, she strangled the animal with her bare hands, somehow killing it and stumbling back to safety, covered in blood. 79. A mother and her baby trapped in a collapsed building. When a powerful earthquake struck Nepal in 2015, rescuers heard faint cries beneath the rubble. Digging for hours, they uncovered a woman shielding her infant with her body. Against all odds, both survived, proving that a mother's instinct is stronger than even an earthquake. 80. A hiker, a canyon, and an unexpected flood. In 2021, a solo hiker in Arizona's slot canyons got caught in a flash flood. With the walls too steep to climb, he braced against the current for 12 hours, holding onto a rock to avoid being swept away. Just when exhaustion set in, a rescue team arrived and pulled him to safety. 81. The wrong turn that nearly became fatal. In 2018, a woman in Oregon drove off a cliff and landed 250 feet below on a rocky beach. Trapped in her wrecked SUV for 7 days, she survived by drinking water from the radiator until hikers finally spotted her. When rescuers arrived, they couldn't believe she was still alive. 82. A parachute failure at 12,000 feet? That's nightmare fuel. But in 2013, skydiver Joan Murray's main chute didn't open, and her backup only partially deployed. She hit the ground at 80 mph, but miraculously, she landed in a fire ant nest. The ants stung her over 200 times, which doctors believe helped restart her heart. Nature works in weird ways. 83. Trapped on a volcano as it erupts? That's what happened to Harry Glicken in 1991 when Japan's Mount Unzen exploded. Surrounded by fire, ash, and lava flows moving at 450 miles per hour, he somehow outran the destruction and made it to safety. Most people wouldn't have made it. He barely did. 84. A baby lost in the jungle should never survive. Yet, in 2015, after a landslide in Colombia, rescuers found an 11-month-old girl alive under the rubble, covered in mud but unharmed. Somehow, despite the chaos, she was protected by the debris around her. A true miracle. 85. A plane crash in the Arctic left a pilot stranded alone for weeks. In 1929, Carl Ben Eilson's aircraft went down in Alaska's freezing wilderness. With temperatures reaching -50 degrees Fahrenheit, he built a shelter out of the wreckage and hunted for food until a search party finally found him 24 days later. 86. You're alone, lost in the mountains, and a blizzard is coming. That was the situation for Eric Lamarck, a snowboarder who got trapped in the Sierra Nevada in 2003. With no food, no fire, and freezing temperatures, he survived 8 days, but had to amputate both feet due to frostbite. Would you have kept going? 87. A bear attack is one thing. What about surviving 3? In 2016, a Russian hunter was mauled by a brown bear, but somehow managed to escape. Then it found him again. He fought back, only to be attacked a 3rd time while trying to crawl to safety. He was rescued weeks later, barely alive, but he lived. 88. A prisoner of war, a jungle, and 3 years of survival. In World War II, British soldier Hugh Clark was captured by the Japanese but escaped into the Burmese jungle. He survived alone for over 1,000 days, dodging patrols and living off the land until Allied forces rescued him. 89. Stranded in the Sahara with a broken-down car. In 1993, Italian man Emile Larey's car broke down in the middle of the desert. Instead of waiting for help, he built a working motorcycle using parts from his wrecked vehicle and rode to safety. Real-life Mad Max. 90. Surviving a tsunami by climbing a tree for 8 hours. In 2004, Indonesian teenager Rafida survived the Indian Ocean tsunami by climbing a palm tree and holding on as waves crashed around her. When the water finally receded, she was covered in bruises but still breathing. 91. 1 second, you're skiing. The next, you're buried alive. In 2019, skier Michael Roker got caught in an avalanche and was buried under 6 feet of snow. With barely any air left, he used his breath to create a tiny pocket of space, just enough to survive 45 minutes until rescuers dug him out. 92. Stranded in shark-infested waters with no life jacket. In 2011, a fisherman in the Bahamas fell off his boat and spent 16 hours treading water. With sharks circling, he kept himself afloat by lying on his back until a passing boat finally spotted him. The fact that he didn't get eaten? A miracle. 93. Trekking through Siberia, alone, for 6 months. In 1941, a Polish soldier escaped a Soviet gulag and walked over 2,000 miles through mountains, deserts, and frozen tundra to reach safety in India. He survived by eating insects, scavenging plants, and avoiding wolves. 94. Imagine being chased by a pack of wolves, at night, in the middle of Siberia. That's what happened to a Russian hunter in 2013. With no gun and no shelter, he climbed a tree and stayed there for 2 days, waiting for the wolves to give up. They never did. He only survived because another group of hunters finally scared them off. 95. Falling off a waterfall usually doesn't end well. But in 2009, a hiker in Yosemite lost his footing and plunged 300 feet down a waterfall. Somehow, he landed in a deep pool of water and surfaced with just a few broken bones. If he'd hit the rocks, game over. 96. Trapped in a sinking car? This woman lived it, twice. In 2017, a driver in Texas was caught in a flash flood and was trapped as her car sank. She smashed the window with her foot and swam to safety, only for another wave to sweep her into a second submerged car. Somehow, she escaped that one too. 97. A 6-year-old lost in the woods for 3 days? In 2018, a young boy in North Carolina disappeared into the forest during a family picnic. Rescuers expected the worst, but when they finally found him, he said, "A bear kept him safe." Real or hallucination? Either way, he made it out alive. 98. Buried in an earthquake and left for dead for 17 days. In 2010, a Haitian man was trapped under the rubble of a collapsed building with no food, no water, and no light. Against all odds, he was pulled out alive by rescuers who were just about to give up searching. 99. Imagine swimming through an oil-covered ocean, on fire. When a Japanese warship was sunk in World War II, a sailor had no choice but to dive into flaming water. He swam underwater for minutes at a time, dodging debris until he found a lifeboat. Out of 1,500 men on board, only 200 survived. 100. Your own body turning against you in the worst place possible. In 2017, a diver had an oxygen tank failure 100 feet below the surface. With no time to think, he slowly exhaled while swimming up, barely avoiding the bends. By the time he surfaced, he was on the verge of passing out, but still alive. 101. A tsunami, a floating refrigerator, and 48 hours lost at sea. In 2018, an Indonesian man was swept away by a massive wave and clung to a floating fridge for 2 days. With nothing to eat or drink, he was completely dehydrated when a rescue boat finally found him, but somehow still conscious. Surviving the impossible takes luck, skill, and an unstoppable will to live. These stories prove that when faced with life-or-death situations, the human spirit can push beyond all limits. Which survival story shocked you the most? Let me know in the comments. And if you enjoyed this wild ride, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that bell so you never miss another mind-blowing video. See you in the next video.